Hey all, welcome back to week 8. After this week, you're halfway done, so good job making it this far. And finish as strong as you can. It's about this part of the semester when everyone is kind of tempted to kind of tone back the effort. And I'm speaking from experience when I say that, as a student myself in a lot of ways. But this week, we're gonna kind of pick up the pace a little bit about the things we cover. And what I mean by that is really we're branching past, the 1830 mark in the Restoration movement. And next week, as we cover the Civil War, or 2 weeks from now when we cover the Civil War, that's going to be the case as well. Just to give you an overview, so the main things we're covering, I'm not going to get into a lot of the groups that join together. I know the book does that, and it's not vital to me that you walk away knowing which groups join what. Really what I want to wrestle with and what I want to spend the time in this video doing is looking at the cracks of the foundation. What were the issues early on in the Restoration movement that kind of exploded through the Civil War, and what divided roughly the North, which was the Christian church, the West, which was the disciples, in the South, which was the churches of Christ. And that's a very rough separation that I'm drawing. But the issues that would eventually lead to, the movement dividing, and also to kind of a national crisis of theological identity. We'll talk about this next week, but the Civil War really was, was a war that 750,000 people died in, but it was also a war that made a lot of churches question who they are. And the Civil War, more than any event in America's history, led to more theological disputes than anything. And so and not just over slavery. So we'll look at that next week. But this week we're going to look at some of the kind of the cracks in the foundation that continued afterwards. Okay, I'm going to start with, I have two kind of different angles from this. I'm going to talk about some of the big picture questions with organizations and why it was such a big problem. Really, this is the part that I'm hoping you get from it. The next slide, when we look at the dates and stuff, again, those are things I want you to be familiar with, but the things I really want you to wrestle with are these theological questions that come up, because there are things that we need to have addressed in our own lives. And so in the 1830s, as the movement begins to build momentum, and as people are joining it, there's a lot of questions about who do you look for an authoritative voice? Alexander Campbell was an authoritative voice for many people in the movement, and I think that's undeniable. And Stone was, at least in the 30s. He kind of loses a lot of his authority after he has a stroke in 1840 and then dies just a few years later. But who do you look for in the movement? And that's not just a question for back then, but right now. For guidance, let me give you a non-hypothetical. Suppose you are in a situation where in a church setting, some people are questioning if you should be the minister or not. This didn't happen to me. And one person said, well, we think that ministers should only be there for 5 years. And regardless of what you think on that, is it really just up to the opinions of the local congregation to settle that sort of dispute? Or what if, again, a non-hypothetical, what if someone was teaching that, only people who are righteous would be alive in the afterlife, meaning that, the people in hell were just not going to be born again and so forth? Who do you go to address it? Or issues of sexuality. I think probably the most pressing one maybe the most pressing one for our time, on issues of sexual identity and male and female and gay marriage and so forth. Who do you look to help you decide what the movement stands for? And how do you know what the movement stands for? Nowadays we can kind of look to colleges a little bit. So you might look to Lincoln, you might ask people at Lincoln, Back then, you would probably focus more on the publications, and that's why people asked the editor, asked Alexander Campbell and the Millennial Harbinger, what his opinion was on some things. But there's a huge question of identity that begins to become a problem here, that on a practical level, as issues arise, and issues were coming up that had never been discussed before within the movement, as issues arise, how do you decide who gets to say what? How do you decide what the truth is? How do you decide what an essential is? And that sort of thing becomes a huge issue. So that's at the bedrock of all of these problems with organizations and schools. And the fear was that if you form this, it's kind of moving on to the second one, if you form an organization and they take a theological stance on an issue, does that mean that the whole movement is obliged to follow that organization? Or does the local eldership have kind of more authority than the organization? In that case, why would you have an organization? And so there's a lot of question, and what has been called by mentors of myself from years ago, what has been called sort of the gaping hole in our movement early on, was this issue of authority. Who do you look to in order to decide these sorts of things? And if you form these organizations and they get a theological stance, kind of moving on to this third one, and let's say, non-hypothetical, 1863, the American Missionary Society joins the Union, or more specifically, they come out strongly in support of the Union. Does that mean that people who are a part of it, who are in the South, are no longer a part of the movement? And so it's a question of identity, it's a question of authority. Whenever they're looking at, should we have a college, or should we have Bible tract societies, even on a state level, the question is not, would these be helpful? But the question is, are we just creating something that we're trying to get away from? Sort of the higher up approach that had been tried and failed before to them. So that was a lot of what was going on. And your book mentions this last point, and other books make a much bigger deal about this, and I think it's maybe appropriate to make a huge deal out of this, that all of this is coming from kind of a conflict between what has been labeled as a loose or a strict view of the Scriptures. Let me give an example of what these are. Let me define them, and then I'll give you an example. Loose kind of argues that there's freedom within the guidelines, that as long as you're not contradicting the Scriptures, you are free to do what is most beneficial, or what you think is right and okay. And the strict would be more, well, since the Colossians and Ephesians mention singing psalms and hymns from your heart, that actually there's no mention of instruments, and so it's a prohibition. And so one of the ways another book describes this, and I think this may be the most helpful way of describing it, is the strict view. When they approach the Scriptures, they view it as a blueprint, meaning you can do what it says and you don't do what it doesn't say. So, of the 1,050 commands in the New Testament, the do's and do nots, they would kind of say, well, those aren't just the suggestions, but those are inclusive of all the things that we are permitted to do, the things we're told we ought to be doing. And with the loose, less of a blueprint and more of a, hey, these are the parameters that you have to have Christ as your Lord, and so you can't sway past that, but you're allowed to have other kind of interests in your life. And so it comes down to an interpretation of the Scriptures. Kind of a comical example of this, and this was a real article posted a number of years ago. A man posted who's kind of coming from this strict background. He posted an article about why the church should use pews. And he talks about the story of Eutychus in Acts. Eutychus was the guy that, Paul's preaching, and he's going to leave the next day, so he preaches deep into the night, and Eutychus falls out of the window and dies, and Paul brings them back to life. And the man in the article says, see, there's a biblical reason why we ought to have pews so that people don't fall out of windows and die. And it might sound strange to try to, I have to find that sort of reasoning in order to justify everything that we do. But that is an appeal to try just to not speak too harshly against it, even though I'm much more in the camp of the loose. But for them, it's, I've got to have a biblical support for what we're doing, or else we're just creating traditions. Okay. I would say that in the North, the loose, and this would be more in line with what would become the disciples in the Christian church. That's more in line with kind of a less of a blueprint and more of these are the parameters that we have to stay in. While in what would become the Church of Christ, so these are the foundations of what would eventually branch out into the three branches of the Restoration movement. The Churches of Christ are much more in line with these strict views. So when it comes to musical instruments, for example, they're the ones who'd say, well, the New Testament doesn't mention using instruments in worship, and therefore it's prohibited. Okay. So all of this to say, it's not just that some people liked the ideas of organizations in schools and some didn't. It was really at the foundation a question of how do we view the scriptures and what does that do with the authority of said organizations. That's what was at stake. And anytime you come across something and you think, well, it's just ridiculous that anyone would argue that point, you always need to ask the question, well, to that person, what is tied to it? What is at stake? What is the risk of it? Because no one wakes up in the morning, and says, I don't want instruments in worship, and that's a problem for me, unless you have something tied to it. And we'll get into all of these issues more. But this is the theological background of a lot of that. Okay, now just to get into just a few of the specifics, American Bible Society, and eventually what becomes the Tract Society forms out of this as well. So it's not just people publishing books of the Bible, kind of like the Gideons do today. And it wasn't just in America. It was actually formed by people from the UK and from America both. And they passed out literature, not just scriptures. Much more influential, however, was the American Christian Missionary Society, which I don't know if you caught this or not, but I'll just mention a few things about this. Alexander Campbell, he got sick and he couldn't go to this, even though he was very in favor of it. And in his absence, they chose him to be president. So one reason why you shouldn't miss church meetings, because you'll get signed up to lead things. But it's a testimony to even in 1849, 17 years after the movements had joined together, that the national convention, the first one, even without the man himself arguing that he should be president, they recognized how much of a voice he was for the whole movement. And so while it's fair to say that there was no kind of national organization or anything like that before, I think Alexander Campbell clearly was the voice of the Restoration movement. And so in practice, it's not as if they're really, this is a pure interpretation on my part, it's not that they were just starting to have these sort of organizations, but that they kind of gave Campbell the power to do things that he's always wanted to be doing. Now, he once spoke against them. Again, the Campbell that you find in the Christian Baptist in 1823 to 1830 is very different than the one you find in the Millennial Harbinger. The one in the Millennial Harbinger is much more inclined to cooperation, even with those who are not a part of the Restoration movement. He's much more sympathetic, and we could say he grew soft in a good way. So that's happening in 1849. And in all of the colleges, the one your book doesn't mention too much about, and I'll just mention, is the Buffalo Seminary, because Campbell for a couple of years ran a school out of his house, or out of his farm, you could say it that way. But most influential was the Bethany College in 1841. Okay. So getting into some of the split-offs. It's not even fair to call it a split off. Depending on the book you've chosen, in the Restoration movement, some would even just talk about this as a completely separate group. But as late as 1837, Alexander Campbell's trying to, he's referring to John Thomas as his brother, but he would go on eventually, after Thomas kind of faded further and further away from orthodoxy. He would call him, he would plainly say, I could no longer consider him my brother. So the Christadelphians, so that's the Christ brothers. They're not very well known even today. I mean, they're very small. If you look at the data about them, there's only about 50,000 of them that exist today. So they're small. They spread more rapidly with him when he was actually alive, especially in England and Scotland. Towards the end of his life, he kind of made one final journey in those areas, and he was very successful, at least with that group. But the clashes that he had, and this gets into, again, the idea of theological authority in the Restoration movement, is that kind of the two main areas that he clashed with Campbell on is this idea of baptism, specifically what someone needs to know when they're getting baptized, and this idea of the Trinity. So if you recall, when we looked at what Barton Stone denied being an Arian. He denied being a Sabellian, but he also had some questionable beliefs about the Trinity. John Thomas would take that out quite a bit further, and he would say that the Spirit was sort of this created power, so he would even call him a person, and he would call the Son lesser than the Father, and so he was very, very clear on his stances on this. And eventually he gets to the point where he's advocating for that openly, and that's part of why Campbell disassociates himself entirely from those who are starting to follow him. But this term that Campbell calls him, an opinionist, there's a lot more to this word than might meet the eye. You're allowed to, within the Restoration movement, believe some things that are not traditionally believed, as long as they're matters of opinions and not essentials. The problem that Campbell had with John Thomas was that John Thomas was going around advocating for these things as if they were clear and certain. So Campbell goes to great lengths in the Millennial Harbinger to get word out about the differences between opinion and essentials, and some of the clearest statements from the movement actually come as a reaction to John Thomas. And that's always true in history, that you don't have a Nicene Creed without Arius. Creeds are, in one simple way of saying it, creeds are a reaction to heresy. And the clarity that you have in the Restoration movement about the Trinity, or the Son being consubstantial with the Father and the Spirit, they come out of statements that are responding to people denying those truths. So, it's just history repeating itself when someone comes in and starts questioning things that have always been believed by Christians. Now, I don't know if you're familiar, I won't go into too much details about it with the Seventh-day Adventists, and I don't think your book mentions this at all, but he actually worked with what they were called the Millerites at the time, and modern Seventh-day Adventists, the ones you'd see down the street, are much different than they were in the early 1800s. In the early 1800s, they're unquestionably believing some things that are just pure heresy, but nowadays they're quite different, and so I wouldn't go as far as to say they are as heretical as they used to be, at the very least. Okay, so that's one of the issues, and I don't want to spend too much time on him. I actually want to spend a lot more time on this next one, on Mormonism. So there's a lot of similarities. There's some important nuanced differences between the Restoration movement and Mormonism, and those nuances, I think, are very telling about the Restoration movement as a whole. And so why I want to spend so much time right now looking at what the Mormons, and specifically Joseph Smith, thought he was doing, starting the Mormon Church. The whole reason I am going to spend that time is because it actually helps clarify what the Restoration or the Reformation was trying to do. So if you go and you look or speak with a Mormon, and one of the first things they'll talk about is the first vision of Joseph Smith, and depending on which account you read, but Joseph Smith, basic core of it is he read James 1 that, if anyone lacks wisdom, they should pray, and God will make it known to them, who gives freely, and the very beginning of James 1. And so Joseph Smith claims he went out into woods one day to pray, and he felt this darkness over him. Not a good sign, not a good part of this story to start with. And then he saw a great light, and the Father and the Son appeared to him as two different beings. It's another major red flag. And Joseph Smith, asked them, which of the denominations should I join? And he was told, and this is where it gets very nuanced, and I want you to see the significant difference between what was told to him, or what he claims he was told, and what the Restoration movement was advocating. He was told that all their creeds were an abomination. Okay, so don't join any of them. That's very different than what the Restoration movement was teaching. The Restoration movement, although they were not using creeds as tests of fellowship, they would never have said that all creeds are an abomination. John Johnson, part of the Stone side from the beginning, so since the Springfield Presbytery, advocated that even though some creeds were flawless, so they weren't not just not dangerous, but they were flawless, they wouldn't be used as tests of fellowship. And then in the Declaration and Address, Thomas Campbell, he would even say that even if a creed is perfect, however beneficial it might be, we won't use those as tests of fellowship. So it's not as if they thought that they were all dangerous and evil. Joseph Smith was advocating that what the creeds weren't just bad for tests of fellowship, but they were actually in fact evil. And so it's a very specific difference that I'm wanting you to see there, because it's important to see what the two different groups were trying to accomplish. Stone and Campbell were all for people coming from these creeds and saying and believing them even after they became a part of the Restoration movement. But Joseph Smith was not. He was, blatantly denying the creeds of the church as if they were heresy. It becomes a big enough problem quickly. Just to fill in the gaps here, in 1830 is when the Mormon Church officially began. They only had about 30 people when they started. They were very small, including some of his family. But by 1831, they're growing so rapidly. And I think the easiest way of describing this is what 2 Corinthians 11 says, that Paul says that, another Christ is preached and you put up with him too well, and that Satan masquerades around as an angel of light seeking who he can devour, and he's trying to trick people to believe another Jesus and another gospel. And that's what the Mormons did, is they kind of crept in with the same language, and they crept in with the same name of Jesus, but preached a very different Jesus. But it appealed to so many people in the Restoration movement because, and you can see how they could twist this idea that all the creeds were an abomination. They could twist that into people who were not using creeds as tests of fellowship. And so it becomes a big enough problem that Campbell himself actually, a year into the Mormon Church existing, writes the book Delusions, which I have as a PDF up on Canvas. It's very short. It's only, I think, 14 pages. But in that, he kind of says, because two of our preachers and parts of their congregations are joining us, and it becomes a bigger and bigger problem as the Mormon Church grows. Because so many people are doing that, I'm just going to write and talk about this. But the short way, if you find it boring to read that, the short way of explaining that is that Campbell goes as far as to say, this is complete rubbish. He says that much more academically, but he's pretty strongly against it. The reason why he feels so compelled to do it is because Sidney Rigdon, who had been, at this point, had been a friend of Campbell's 8 years ago, was such a strong advocate in Mormonism. And in 1844, so that's the year that Joseph Smith was shot in jail. If you remember that story, he was jumping out of the prison trying to run away, and the mob shot him. Rigdon, they don't all join the same church afterwards. All the Mormons kind of split off into different groups after that. The biggest would be Brigham Young, as in Brigham Young University, and that whole organization, which is what we would call the Latter-day Saints today. But Rigdon leads another group entirely. And for a while, you can see the influence of the Restoration movement on him still. They call themselves the Church of Christ. It's quite remarkable. I won't get too much into this, but Sidney Rigdon, he's actually tarred and feathered with Joseph Smith. And in 1832, Joseph Smith claims to have all these visions with Sidney Rigdon, and they're very close friends. And part of them have somewhat of a dispute because Joseph Smith tries to marry again. Joseph Smith had at least 56 wives, according to Fawn Brodie, who was a Mormon alive at that time, kicked out of the Mormon Church. Anyway, tries to marry one of Sidney Rigdon's relatives, and that upsets him. But the bigger point I'm wanting you to see is that they were so close. It's interesting that after he dies, Sidney Rigdon denies the 12 apostles of the Mormon Church, and in turn, they deny him, and there's a split. And some of Joseph Smith's family joined Sidney Rigdon instead of Brigham Young. They don't tell you that if you go to a Mormon church, but that's what happened. Okay, and another significant difference with the Restoration movement is, and they still teach this, is that they taught that it's not just that, there was creeds shouldn't be used as test of fellowship, but in fact, after the apostles died, there was the great kind of apostate. There was the apostasy, that the church ceased to exist until Joseph Smith restarted it in 1830. Now, they argued other things as well. And one of the most remarkable things they argued is that Jesus appeared to different groups in America, and as a result of that, they thought that Jesus was going to return. And you can read about this in the Doctrine and Covenants, that Jesus was going to return to Missouri, and that's where the New Eden was going to be. One similarity, as strange as this might sound, with Alexander Campbell is Alexander Campbell had such a high view of what America was doing that he thought that the movement would continue to grow and grow, and America would kind of lead the way to the restoration of the church. But he never would have said, Alexander Campbell would never have said that the church ceased to exist and that he was kind of restarting the church. That's very far removed. And so while there's certain parallels going on and the different mindsets that were happening in this time frame, there's some major differences theologically going on here. Okay. I'm going to move on now to what is certainly one of the most important issues of the 19th century in America. What would become the bedrock and the roots of probably the greatest theological dispute among all American denominations, apart from the Mennonites and the Quakers, maybe also. But apart from the Quakers and the Mennonites, we'll talk about this next week. pretty much every denomination split over the issue of slavery. And not just pro or for, but how do we set them free, and how does that all go about happening? So just to set the stage a little bit, the numbers vary. I mean, I get this from one scholar, but I've seen numbers as high as 20 million if you're including all the slaves who are taken from Africa and taken to kind of the British different colonies all over the world. But in the New World specifically, so up to from the beginning of America up to the Civil War, about 12.6 million Africans are stolen or traded and brought over on a 2-month voyage over to the New World. Now that is absolutely remarkable. And if you'll notice this too, almost 2 million of them, or almost essentially a sixth of them, died on the 2-month voyage. I mean, of all the embarrassments that your nation can have, I think this is a good contender for the greatest national embarrassment and darkest part of our history, just plain and simple. Just to fill you in a little bit on how this happened, and kind of following the money, so to speak, is it wasn't just, even though this certainly happened, it wasn't just people going to the west coast of Africa and stealing people and chaining them and taking them to the New World. That happened. But much more common, as the trade routes became more established, was sort of a triangle of trade, that the people in America, because they had slave labor, traded some of their cotton or produce or whatever they were using the slaves for guns and so forth, and different kinds of trading. They would then take those weapons, travel to Africa, and one tribe would sell another tribe that they had captured for better weapons, and then they would take those weapons and then capture another tribe. And so it's just evil all around. I mean, there's not a whole lot of silver lining of anything good that was happening there. I'm sure God was at work in some way. I just certainly don't know how. But so you both had people who were just plain stolen from their homeland, and others who were captured in their homeland and then sold. And so there was a lot of evil taking place. One of the slave traders, who was a captain of several ships, who wrote the song Amazing Grace. And actually the song Amazing Grace comes from a man who eventually, after traveling with slaves, became a strict abolitionist. And during the Second Great Awakening, the song Amazing Grace took power because someone knew that what he had done in the slave trade was so evil. He was blind, but now he sees. He needed help because he was a wretch, and grace saved him. And a lot of people left this after seeing the great evils from it. And I'll come back to some of that here in a moment. But just to show you the different stances that were taking place there. So there were essentially 3 different views that were being passed around within the Restoration movement. And I'll just to go over them, I'll say a few words. Some were okay with slavery as an idea, but against how it was being practiced. I shared with you that passage that Campbell wrote from 3 Peter, that satire work, where he's open about, it's evil to go and steal people from a land and take them and separate families, and all of that is evil. And the way it's being practiced in America is evil. Okay, a few different ways he says that. But you can't also deny that there's even in the New Testament claims of Slaves, obey your master. And the conflict that you have is, okay, well, what if slavery as it was being practiced was wrong, but you still wanted to come out as not necessarily against all forms of slavery? That's a bit of the tension that's going on. And I'll be honest with you, I've read just about everything that Campbell has said on slavery, and I would go as far as to say I wish he would be stronger about it. Just plain and simple, I wish he would be stronger about his abolitionist takes, and sometimes he makes claims that are very abolitionist and anti-slavery, but other times he's not as strong, and I really think you can make him seem like he's saying one thing or another depending on which quote you get. The later Campbell, especially as he's approaching the Civil War, and he is in many ways foreseeing how big of an issue this is between the North and the South, between the Churches of Christ and up north the disciples, that he tries to take a stance where he's saying, slavery as it's practiced is evil, but can we at least agree that the Bible does allow for a form of slavery to be practiced? And that's the tension that he's holding. So that's one of the stances. And kind of along with that, there were a lot of people who were arguing for freedom for slaves, but not kind of immediate, kind of a gradual way for it to be done. So like when they ended the slave trade and they gave it 20 years to be done, they kind of disagreed on how, but a lot of people wanted slavery to end, but they wanted it to be gradual. So that's one stance. And really the stance of course, it's always easier in hindsight to know which position you should have taken, but the stance I take now very firmly is sort of this abolitionist stance that, as many people in the Restoration movement argued, and Frederick Douglass in England and Scotland kind of made famous. So when Campbell went there and he was questioned by the abolitionists because of Frederick Douglass, they were pointing to Stone and they were pointing to other people in the Restoration movement who made strong claims that all of the slavery that was being practiced was evil and should stop, and that Christians needed to not do that. So Stone, for what it's worth, that's strongly my opinion. And then there were others, to our shame, who were pro-slavery. Now, to clarify, I have no problem just plainly saying they were wrong, but they weren't advocating anything along the lines of dehumanizing people, even slaves. Really, some of their arguments, and I've read a lot of their arguments at this point, I still don't know truthfully what they were really trying to say. Some of them were simply trying to say that, well, since the Bible allows it, we need to allow it to be practiced. And even however you want to twist the scriptures to make it say what you want it to say, you've got to admit that what was being practiced in America was gross and evil and a national embarrassment to look back on. And so, I don't want to just hide the fact that there are some dark parts of our history. While there was a lot of other conflict of people advocating other things, there were some within the movement, particularly in the South, and that becomes a bigger problem again with the Civil War and what follows, who were pro-slavery. Okay. Now, I mentioned this, your book doesn't talk about this at all, but it raises some eyebrows. The sister of Alexander Campbell operated the Underground Railroad 10 miles from Campbell's house. And of course, I can't prove it, but I am certainly under the impression, and this is not an idea original to me in any way, but because of the way Campbell's house was built, because of the freedom that he had in his basement particularly, and because of the land that he had in that area and the money that he had, it seems to suggest that Alexander Campbell himself helped in the Underground Railroad, that he helped actually slaves escape and find freedom. So, however much he, was vocal that what was being practiced was evil, it seems like in practice in his own life that he was helping slaves escape. Okay, and it's an educated conjecture on my part. It's not a fact, but it is something that I think is arguable. I also want to mention this. There were some interesting things going on. This is a weird time in our history. So in Kentucky, at this point, if you were free and you were black, you were not allowed to be a clergy in kind of an established way. You couldn't stay there and preach at a church. And so, as strange as this is, and this is a weird moment in history, one of the things that the Christian Missionary Society decides to do, and again, they side with the Union, and 5 years from 1852, they side with the Union, so they make their stance quite clear, but they actually purchase a slave, who ironically, his name was Alexander Campbell, though he was he was a black man named Alexander Campbell. This isn't the Alexander Campbell that we've talked so much about. But they purchase him so that he can still preach there. That is just wild and wacky. But that's what was going on. And so you have some instances of Christians actually making the most out of an evil situation. And in some cases, purchasing slaves for the sake of freedom. In other cases, purchasing them so they can keep on working and share the gospel. All right. So it is, again, a dark part of our history. There are some silver linings. There's some bright moments. And there's some plain dark moments of evil that were taking place. And so I'm just showing you how it is and asking us not to make the same mistake. And on that, I want to look at, and I do have a reason for sharing this, I want to look at some of the arguments that were used for pro-slavery activists. So there's the clause that they're not fully human. I mean, all of these are arguments you can find kind of readily available in the literature of the time, and there are books being written in this time kind of arguing for slavery. And it wasn't just that you were considered 3/5, but the way that the law read was 3/5 represented, 3/5 of a human if you were not a citizen. And, you didn't own property or anything like that. It didn't specifically mention slavery, but that was what it was talking about. That if you count as 3/5 for a representative for Congress. So it's not that your views themselves as a black individual at this time were being represented, but actually if you were a slaveholder, and let's say you hold a few slaves, it actually gave you a bigger voice in Congress because all your slaves counted as 3.5 when they're considering how to divide out Congress. So that's what the law or the article originally intended. And so actually part of the embedded in the way Congress was functioning was that slaves were not recognized as fully human. And so that's part of the argument. You're not fully human. And part of the other argument was the economic stability of many depended on it. When the South lost and slavery became illegal, the South became a lot poorer, and things changed rapidly. The North, with the Industrial Revolution, they became clearly the more wealthy of the two groups. And so there was a big fear of, if we get rid of all of this slavery, money is being spent. If you're bringing over 12.6 million people and selling them for about $1,000 each, you're talking about the largest piece of, and even larger than the price of land, you're talking about the largest, so to speak, item that is being traded. And not just that, but they're producing something. And so this is a massive undertaking. If you abolish this, and this is why some people wanted it to be gradual, if you abolish this, you would devastate the economy. Now, who's going to take care of them? Okay, and there was an argument also, especially prominent in the South. What happens on my property is my business, and no one can kind of come in and tell me what to do on it. Blacks, according to the Supreme Court, so the Dred Scott and Stanford decision of 1857, they made the statement as, and certainly one of the top worst choices the Supreme Court has ever made in the United States. They made the decision that blacks were not and could never be citizens of America. So that's what they said in 1857. So it made it clear that you were not going to have legal standing. And so the blacks had no legal rights. They were on someone else's property. They were economic stability. They weren't fully human. And one of the weirder arguments, at least to me, was, and this was, of the books that I've read on this, this is the most prominent. I don't know how widespread this is, but in the local cases and the debates I've seen of this in Kentucky, one of the key things they brought up is, hey, the slaves are provided food and water and shelter and security, and it's actually better than the workers up in the North. Is that weird and a terrible argument? Yes, but that's what was being said, that it was actually better for them to be slaves. Now, how do you believe anything like this? Well, may I just for a moment change just a few words from each of these and suggest that, similar to the crisis in the 19th century over the humanity of slaves, that there is a similar crisis going on now. And so let me just say, if I can change a few words, and you'll start to hear these arguments still prevalent in America today. So just a few words to change in all of them. The fetus is not fully human. The mother can't afford to raise the child, or who's going to pay for the child if the child is allowed to be born? And instead of what happens on my property is my business, what happens in my body is my business. And unborn children have no legal standing. And if those children are going to be born, their life would be full of misery. Just to say it plainly, the arguments that were being debated among Christians in the 19th century over slavery are logically, mathematically identical to the arguments that are being made over abortion and life of children unborn now. So don't say that these are all gone from our culture, because they're not. And if we are not careful, we'll find ourselves hating that arguments like this used to exist, and yet kind of tolerating it now, and not just tolerating it, but even being tempted to believe some of the same things now. So my opinion on it is quite clear that, just because the Supreme Court said something in 1857, that doesn't mean that blacks were any less human or couldn't be citizens. The Supreme Court was wrong, and it's okay to say that. And similarly, it is okay to say now that yes, that unborn child is fully human. Yes, it might make the economy strain a great deal more to have children born, but that's better than the alternative. And it's not just my body, my choice. It's not just my property, my business. And it doesn't matter if you have legal standing, that's a human person. And it's not better off if that person died. You don't eliminate suffering by eliminating the one who suffers. Okay, So I'll just leave that there. But that's how those opinions kind of permeate the church today. And we're still arguing over very similar things. All right, one final slide for us. The instruments. I think it's safe to say this becomes the most prevalent of all of the theological disputes in the Restoration movement. And it's not as if it was a one-topic problem, but as someone once said, and I think he was quite accurate, the instrument dispute and the controversy over using instruments in worship was the final nail in the coffin for what eventually would lead to the split between the Church of Christ and the disciples. There was other issues, from the beginning, but this was the final nail in the coffin. The story is that people were singing so bad. People were singing so bad that they brought in what amounts to be sort of like a small piano or organ. It's called a melodeon. I've never heard one of these played. This is the actual one, by the way. The one I have on the left here. This is the first instrument used, and it's still kept in one of the libraries at Midway in Kentucky. And in Midway in Kentucky, that's in the church there. The guy who reports on it, he says the singing was so bad that we're scaring the rats away. So I would have loved to have been there. And really, it sounds like me leading worship. I mean, I sing nice and loud and unashamed, and I am glad that I'm drowned out in the voices of everyone else who's there, because I don't have a good singing voice, but who cares? I mean, make a joyful noise for the Lord. And so that's what happens at Midway. Prior to this, no one, so we're talking about, almost 30 years in the Restoration movement, no one used a musical instrument at all. Okay, I mean, a cappella, which literally means in the manner of the choir or the church assembly, singing a cappella was the way to sing, and not just in the Restoration movement. Other denominations went through the same sort of dispute that the Restoration movement did. I mean, the Presbyterians, John Calvin and Luther, they were not for the use of instruments at the time of worship. Okay, it's a kind of a recent development, and it's crazy to hear now. I mean, I grew up about the time when different guitars and drum sets were starting to be used more and more in worship, and it's still a dispute in some places. But it's funny to hear people talk about, I miss the good old days of just using a church organ or piano, when that actually, this was the drum set of its day. This was the thing that people were in a huff about. And it's easy to see how it became more widespread because the singing improved. But the question again was, if the Bible doesn't explicitly mention it, can we use it? And if it mentions singing songs from your heart, does that mean we shouldn't use instruments as a part of worship? And that's not a unique issue for the Restoration movement. What is unique to the Restoration movement, I mean, it's very uncommon for other groups to do this, is ours kind of split over it. Not just over this issue, but it was a much bigger deal, much more divisive in the Stone Candle movement than in other groups. But Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, others were, at the time, equally arguing about this. And one of the things that, and I'll just mention this and then I'll kind of close this out. One of the reasons why this became a problem is because city churches were becoming more wealthy, and city churches were allowed, with those finances, they started using their money for societies and for missions and so forth, but also for instruments. And kind of the poorer South, who was trying to raise money for widows and so forth, they saw the North purchasing instruments. There's a very specific case I'll show next week. But part of the controversy was over money. I think in hindsight, it's fair to say that why would you decorate your church with some sort of financial burden that could be better used for something else? So that's what begins to take place. So a lot of things were happening at this time. It was an exciting time when organizations were joining in the Restoration movement. Lots of different Baptists were joining in, and at the same time, heretical groups like the Mormons were taking away people and stealing them, and they're still doing that. And it's up to us to decide how to move forward. I mean, this is the beginning of the foundation has been laid, and now the three branches, because of the issues mentioned today and during the Civil War, the three branches really start to branch off in the Restoration movement. So from here on out, we'll talk a whole lot more about the differences between the disciples, which at this point is speaking of the disciples, and the Christian church in the North and West, and the Church of Christ, which was much more prevalent in the South. Is that the case everywhere? No, but I like to speak in generalities just to help us not be confused, and I'll show a lot of maps next week as we talk about it. All right, so that's it. Remember, there's no class next week, so enjoy your week off, and I certainly will. Thankful for all of you, and I hope you have a great time of rest, and be sure to reach out to me if you have any questions.